Welcome to the Alain Elkann interviews, an unprecedented window into the minds of some of the most well-known and respected figures of the last 25 years.
I was born in China. I was born in Chongqing, a name that actually many Westerners never heard of, but it was the Pacific wartime capital of China.
And when did you move to Europe?
I moved to the UK at age of 16, so when I was 16, so 2002. It's 19 years now.
And was it easy for you to?
No, it wasn't easy. It wasn't easy to integrate it with the British high school. I mean, doing A-levels. It's not just in terms of study, but in terms of culture shock of getting...
You moved by yourself or you moved with your family?
It was my own decision because I was quite keen to study things on international relations or international politics. The time when I was in high school in China, my history teacher told me, perhaps there's only two places in this world that can study, the subjects of international relations, such as the United States and UK, because these are dominant world powers. And you have to be there to know how the world has been organized. He was referring to after 1945, the world order, but not the world order where we are now.
But are you going back to China from time to time?
I am going back to China from time to time because my parents are still living there and I'm the only child. But obviously, given the COVID, I'm not able to go back because my country has the world's most stringent quarantine criteria.
China was somehow on the threat during the Trump regime because he was calling the pandemic Chinese, right? So somehow he accused China to be the cause of this pandemic.
Well, I mean, he used the term China virus or Wuhan virus have constantly using that term. But at the end of the day, who knows where is the origin come from? I mean, in terms of investigation of the origins, if it is a scientific investigation, I think that would be benefit for all. But if it's the investigation that based on letting China's international reputation damage even further, and I think this is something that the Chinese government will very much disapprove. So as you can see already, that this is probably another strand of the China-US relations.
How many inland Chinese people exist today?
1.4 billion. Yeah.
So among these 1,400,000,000, how many people are well-read or have a middle class standard of life, and how many are literate people?
I mean, the literacy rate in China is extremely high, and I would say like 95% in terms of literacy and numeracy rate. But however, if we're speaking about middle class, and I would say it is only around 60% of the entire population. And I didn't say this. It was the Chinese premier, so the Chinese number 2, has suggested that there are still 40% of the Chinese population still live under the salary of $115 a month. So 40% of the Chinese population, which is not yet within that bracket of what we consider as being part of the middle class.
And how many very wealthy people there are in China?
This way, China have more billionaires than the United States. And it is a country, I would say, run by two Germans. Because the countries that deeply believe Karl Marx's communism with the political establishment. But this is also a country that acquired the very extravagant taste of Karl Lagerfeld's design. So I was joking with many of my German friends that China actually is a society dominated by two Germans. You have Karl Marx for ideology, but you have Karl Lagerfeld for the consumerism, so the two cars.
How many are very wealthy?
I would say, if we're talking about billionaires, around 132.
Only 132?
Yeah, 132 billionaires.
Yeah, and there are many rich people
Yeah.
without being billionaires, right?
I mean, what's your standards by being rich? Because the definition of being rich in China is
the
different.
The reason why I am asking you this is because some of the Western countries in the last 20 years relied so much on the Chinese market, on several layers, truck makers.
Yep.
Isn't it dangerous to rely so much on China? And is this going to last forever, or will the Chinese one day with their own luxury brands, and will the Europeans or the Americans be able to invest in Chinese companies and become the owners of the Chinese companies?
I mean, we have to say all good things can't last forever. Solely by letting the Western luxury companies rely on Chinese market, I think is not a very good strategy. Partially
Not a
because
strategy for the Western.
not good for the Westerners, partially because most of the customers that the Europeans would like to attract in China are already acquired that taste of the luxury taste that they wanted to buy. But then you still live the proportion of the population perhaps can't afford, perhaps never be able to afford for those luxury products, and they never really intended to afford that. So that's one layer. Now the second reason is in recent years, among the Chinese younger population, what I mean by younger are those who were born after 90s and after 2000, there's a wave of go back to domestic made Chinese products. This very much in favor of buying the Chinese own luxury brand. I mean, like for example, the Huawei high-end phone, the mobile phones. Huawei is
Mobile phones.
mobile phones, and also
it's not by Apple.
it's not. Apple sales in China really stalled in recent years. They're not hugely as popular as in the past. So there seems that sense of revival of buying the Chinese own brand. So that again would also jeopardize the Western luxury companies' strategy and attract different clienteles. They're just not interested anymore, I think. I think also part of the reason this is down to the quite strained relations between China and the West, that the Chinese consumers, especially the Chinese young consumers, are rightly proud of its own country. They felt their country have achieved so much, but has been constantly criticized by the Western media. And one thing that the Chinese youngsters, they're seeking nowadays, they're seeking that sense of respect coming from the Western society. And they feel quite sadly they have not received that respect they wanted. So that perhaps another way that the Western luxury companies may no longer have the same appeal as in the past. Like, for example, my generation, for those who were born in the 70s and 80s.
It seems that China has a much stronger will and organization to give vaccine to other countries, right? Asian countries or African countries.
Sure.
And this is something that maybe the West did much less. And it's good in a way because they help a lot of people. But in the other way, it's also a way to become more popular among our neighbors, let's say, or to be more and more popular in continents like Africa, right?
I mean, it is, but I think there are two reasons.
There is a strategy on that.
There's a strategy, but there's also an out of necessity. I mean, I think perhaps out of necessity is more important, that most of the Chinese investments are in those continents, are in, like, for example, South Asia, Africa, because the Chinese will have to protect its own investment, protect its own infrastructure, and protect its own the Belt and Road projects that have been invested in the past. By suddenly having this pandemic, and many of the projects will in a stop moment. So the most perhaps the best way to do so is to sending vaccines of those countries where China have invested very, very heavily in terms of the Belt and Road Initiative and also in terms of infrastructure projects to save its own investment. So, I mean, for me, that is firstly out of necessity, but secondly, it is a political strategy that China is keen to have the influence, to extend its political influence to the many of the developing countries. Because the Chinese have this old saying, you always provide a burning coal in a time of heaviest snow. So the friends or whoever the recipients will remember you and helping the friends in need.
But what happens in the economy, a company like Alibaba, right, which is bigger than Amazon, right, is functioning very well in China, right? But the share went very much down, and the leader, Jack Ma, was, I don't say persecuted, but I mean there were problems with him.
Yeah.
And now, recently, there is a new real estate big problem going on with Evergrande.
Evergrande.
What's happening there?
For me, this is not surprise at all. For me, this is a very clear signal that the legitimacy of the Chinese Communist Party to its population has now shifted. So in the past, before the 1st of July this year, in the past, the legitimacy of the party to the population, it is always about let's creating double-digit growth. So the quantitative share of the economic growth that perhaps will benefit the small proportion of the society, so the entrepreneurial classes. But then I think after the 1st of July, the party centenary this year, the party legitimacy has now shifted from pursuing equality, improving the standard of living for the ordinary population for all, and plus a very nationalistic foreign policy. So these are the twin elements of the current Chinese Communist Party's legitimacy to sustain its rule. So it's a different kind of social contract. Now come back to the Alibaba question, is that because Jack Ma is able to use enormous amount of financial resources or financial derivatives to amass huge amount of wealth without creating too much productivity to the society. And then the Chinese authority felt it is the productivity issue that Jack Ma did not create it. And also this gives the society an impression that by not working too hard, as long as you'll be able to assemble huge amount of capital, you can be the winner of a society. And the Communist Party believe that is the wrong value. And that's why Jack Ma has now become the benchmark on the wrong page of the authority. I'm not really surprised to see that happen at all. I mean, equally that apply to the property developer Evergrande. Again, because he was be able to mobilize enormous financial resources and put in different derivatives. And those derivatives are being purchased by lower income level families of China, the ordinary investors, very low income level household to buying those financial derivatives. And once if they are not stable, if they go bust, and those people will be out of money. So I think the government consider this enormous financial instability within those two companies, and that's why they go after them.
But how is the economy, the real economy going? They say that China is doing less well, that Chinese economy is not in such good shape as it used to be. Where is the truth?
I mean, the truth is that the economy is now experiencing great difficulties for short-term and longer-term reason. Short-term reason is because the global demand in terms of export is in decline. So the old model of using export-generated economic growth are no longer sufficient for China. And secondly, the medium-term reason is the demographic decline, because you have less and less younger labor force to be able to compete with. So the demographic dividends for China is
a strange equation, and the fact that you are so many, why do you want to be many more? This is economically strange, because if you are many more, there will be many more poor people, right? So why they encourage families until a certain point not to have children, and now they encourage people to have children.
Yeah, the logistic of this is in the past, there's no enough societal resources to have more children. So they wouldn't have enough housing or schooling or even not enough food in the time of Mao, the time of Mao time. And then lately, Deng Xiaoping's era, is not even enough social resources to be distributed to those families. Therefore, one-child policy be introduced, and I'm part of that one-child policy generation, children. But nowadays, as the society realizes reducing in demographics, and then they will have to mitigate the risk of having reduced the number of work labor force in the longer term.
So the work labor force will be more expensive.
It will be far more expensive.
Your products will be more expensive. Therefore, you will have more competition with other countries for labor force. People, instead of opening factories in China, they may open them in Croatia or no?
I think that's already happened. That has already happened. Even the Chinese entrepreneurs do not seeking to have labor forces in China anymore.
They open elsewhere.
They open somewhere in Vietnam or in Cambodia. That process has already happened. But I think what the Chinese government is intended to do, but whether they succeeded or not, we don't know. What they intended to do, it is to increasing productivity among the working labor forces. Because at the moment, that current generation of the Chinese young workers, they know how to do the exams, but they don't know how to make things because they're in that education system. They've been taught how to perform in the exam very well, but not really making things or having a proper training, prepare for a proper job. So that is part of the story, that protectivity that authority is worried about. And that's why you see the policy come up of, like, for example, reducing the after-class tutorial. Like after they finish school and then they'll have to do that, then of course the government recently have this policy that reducing the after-class tutorial. So that's one policy. Second policy is that the children only allowed to play online video games for about 3 hours, because again, those video games do not really help with the general productivity of the population. So that's one policy. Now the second policy then come back to the Alibaba question. Because Alibaba question, that model, it is based on finance, it is based on assemble money. It is not based on producing things and making things. So it's very much a go against the government current economic strategy. And so I think that's part of the reason why Alibaba being clamped down.
I think that Obama, Trump and Biden wanted to remove the troops from Afghanistan because of internal politics, right? Because the Americans were fed up with, saying, why should we fight a war far away from home, lose our children, this is, and plus all that being so expensive, right?
Yeah.
And most of governments do moves because of internal politics more than even foreign politics are the consequence of internal problems.
Yeah.
So are the Chinese pleased with the regime, with the party? And is the party, in their eyes, successful in running the country over the years? And it was also a shock for the world when your leader suddenly decided that instead of having elections, he would be the leader forever, right? So he self-proclaimed himself a kind of dictator, right, or emperor, or whatever. How this was perceived. And there is a possibility in China of an implosion, that for instance these 40% people who are not well off and are in bad condition say, why? Why are people with Rolls Royces who buy Hermes bags and Cartier jewelry and we are starving, because they may know, or I don't know if they know, they don't, but how this is perceived inside China.
Yeah, this has probably come to a second element of that legitimacy question. You're absolutely right. Any country's foreign policy are determined by domestic politics, and for China, that is even more than the United States. And I would say 95% of the Chinese foreign affairs are determined by its domestic politics. Most importantly, that the leadership, the Communist Party, want to present that narrative that this People's Republic of China, this PRC government, is respected across the world. That is the key message that Xi Jinping wants to send it back home. So before pandemic, he was actually most traveled, the Chinese president, since 1949, since the country founded. What he was intended to do is he intended to show his domestic audience that he was so much welcomed by everyone across the world. And that's why back to 2015, in this country, there was a state visit. The so-called red of the reddest carpet rollover for Xi Jinping, by the British Queen. So that is the important for the party about image issue, about narrative.
You say that they are legitimated all over the world.
Not just legitimate, but respected. I think it's the word that the Chinese leadership is seeking, both for the Chinese leaders, but also for the Chinese general public. They're seeking that sense of respect, which they are yearning for many, many years. They didn't get it in the past. This is also a country that gone through a quite tumultuous history up until 1979, like the crazy 10 years of Cultural Revolution, and before that you have the Civil War and then also the Second World War. So the country is seeking to reasserting its global status, and most importantly, that global status needs to be presented back to domestic population to show that this government is respected. and therefore to letting the population support the leadership. So that's one layer.
And do we know if they really supported, or if they are afraid? Like many times it happens in totalitarian regimes, right?
I mean, this we don't know. The whole point is because they're 1.4 billion population. So you have all sort of opinions towards the leadership. I'm sure this discussion across the household dinner table are quite vibrant as many other countries. But perhaps this should not go into the record for many of the Chinese public.
And what is the population feeling about the lack of human rights? I mean, the fact that the world, the Western world, is mostly accusing China and other to be, a country where the human rights are not respected, and therefore there is a general feeling that in China you can do all what you want, because nevertheless, there is no democracy, so the party can do everything.
No, the party can't do everything.
And the party controls the press and all kinds of freedoms.
The party certainly control the press. I mean,
Press,
yeah.
TV,
Most of the press, yeah. In terms of the human rights elements which you touched upon in here, is that the Chinese population generally have a different perception towards human rights. I mean, this is the perception that they felt the rights to eat, the right to have shelter, a roof, perhaps is more important than, for example, the right to vote or the right to speak up for itself. I mean, again, if you put in a longer perspective, this is the country hasn't really achieved that much up until 1979. So at the moment, the Chinese population have never had a much better life than compare what they have it now. So the likelihood of go against the leadership is pretty low because they haven't really reached that stage yet. They're looking for greater political freedom or looking for greater voices on different opinions. Now, second element, more interestingly, is I'm just observing from many of the overseas Chinese who have either studied or worked in Western liberal democracies, and they become even more patriotic because they felt perhaps this one-party system would fit for China better than, say, for example, for multi-party system like what they have in the West. I mean, the really interesting thing is that among the Chinese younger population who they have studied abroad and then they return to China, they become even more convinced that one-party state would fit China better than in the time of where they studied in the liberal democracies.
So the fact that today there is an economy that is not as strong as before is worrying the party very much?
Oh, very much. I mean, the party is very much worried about this economy because in order to, what Xi Jinping has set up the goal is the so-called 2035 goal. So by the time of the 2035, that China will become middle to high level income country, and which require 4.5% of GDP growth per year. And that is very hard to sustain given the current Chinese productivity.
What worries is that we complain about civil rights in China, but we are very much dependent on China for our economy, right?
Sure.
So there is a contradiction in terms of philosophy and actual activity.
Yeah.
There are several issues. The fact that in the European sense they don't respect human rights. Secondly, the fact that they need a strong China in order to sell as much as they can various kind of products to China. Third, if China becomes too strong and therefore will be the leading power in the Western world, America losing its power, right? How will it be for the Europeans to be on the Chinese umbrella? So this is a very complicated issue. But if I perceive well, all these contradictions are at the moment worrying the markets, the governments, and also the people. We obviously don't talk on personal. This is not a personal question.
Sure. Okay. 3 layers in here. Firstly, when we're talking about America now, close its door, become more self-resilient. And I see that similar trend also happened to China as well, because the Chinese leadership realized itself does not want to making the same mistakes as what American has done in the past by overstretching itself. So that's one layer. China would also closing its door gradually, and China will choose what kind of foreign investment that China want and on which sector that China wanted to have foreign investments. So the era that China with open arms welcoming all investments from overseas, that era is ended. We can see that. So China itself become more, self-reliant. That is very clear, come from the latest economic 5 years plan, the 14th 5 years plan published this year. Now, the second layer is about that under the so-called the Chinese umbrella. Now, would have to be clear in here that it is never going to be a Sino-centric world order, because China simply doesn't have the capacity and the capability to convince the rest of the world that its political system, which could be applicable across the world. So there was never really that so-called Sino-centric international order that should be organized. And even if such a thing are being put forward to, the only element I can see it is that using economic development as the founding principle of the so-called Sino-centric international order. So while we're talking about the Chinese under the Chinese umbrella, I don't see such age would exist. Now, lastly, regarding China and Europe, of course, the nature, the fear of the human nature of unknown. Of course, Europeans are fear of those come from China. But on the other hand, I think China has also been quite disappointed by the Europeans, because China was much hoping the time of 2003, 2005 that European Union, specifically European Union, would become a polar of international affairs, of international politics. So being a single polar, and that would somehow counterbalance the United States. And that didn't happen. And then after the global financial crisis and after the sovereign debt crisis, and China was hoping European Union would step in, playing a bigger role. Again, that didn't happen. So I think China has now really lowered the expectation of the capability of EU, what EU can do regarding as being automatic player in international politics. So I think it's not just the Europeans' fear of China, but it also come from the disappointment from Beijing's side that they realize the limitation of the European countries, what they can do. While President Macron was talking about the strategic autonomy of the EU, but where it just started, it started from nowhere. And clearly for this recent deal between UK, US, and Australia shows that United States, of course, giving more emphasis towards in the Asia-Pacific or Indo-Pacific to compete with China, and less so with a focus within Europe. That's how the world has been changed.
And do you think that the yuan is going to become new dollar? Or?
No, yuan will not become new dollar because yuan hasn't got that capability. Because by become internationalized the currency, that the authority need to have the audacity to open the capital account. And at the moment, I don't...
You're not going to internationalize the yuan?
No, because by internationalized yuan, you need to have a demand. It's not only the supply issue. It is more to do with the demand issue. But the demand is not there because IMF basket currency, yuan is only 2%. It's the smallest of the smallest. It's the political significance that yuan being in the basket currency, but by no way that yuan have sufficient demand to become international currency. So I don't think China be able to do that at this moment, given its very closed political system, given its political system is so different from the rest of the world. They can't convince international investors to have letting yuan become international currency.
The world of today is very much concerned by global warming, sustainability, ecological problems, green, and all that, right? This awareness of all these problems is growing, right? And therefore, the global party, or let's call it green people, and in the same time, the big changes in the technology world, which will be more and more hydrogen and electric energy, there will be artificial intelligence, and all these big changes in technology. how is China reacting to that? How do they cope with that? And how are the Chinese, in one way of the huge technological progress, and in the other side, the growing attention and participation to this sustainable world?
Yeah, I mean, for China, it's a dual identities here. So on the one hand, the domestic political agenda that climate change and the sustainability and carbon reduction are very much high up on the agenda and the Xi Jinping's time, because he was talking about building ecological civilization, part of the party legitimacy, ecological civilization, written into the party charter. So domestically, it is very important, and then several crucial policies being introduced. I mean, most notably, it is how are you going to judge whether you're going to promote a senior official or not? And you have to look into how many tons of carbon reduction that particular person have been made for that particular institutions or for that particular province. So domestically, it's quite radical and interventionist approach when it comes to climate change, because this, again, it's about tangible benefit. It's about tangible visibility that to show the party can deliver clean air, clean water for its population. Now, internationally, China seems to be rather timid and hesitated, and China take the hat of the global south by suggesting that China is a developing country, therefore shouldn't shoulder the similar responsibility as what the Western countries have already done, because the Western countries obviously is the polluter much longer time than compared with, for example, China and India. So internationally, I think China's commitment is more hesitated, is more limited. And also China, especially the Chinese leaders, doesn't want to be seen that it follow the agenda put forward by the United States. Again, it's about how domestic audience view China's
And how are the young people in China?
They don't feel much about it. The Chinese younger generation, you have a small proportion of the youngsters care about it. But
and these people are encouraged or punished?
These people are indifferent. I mean, I do know some young students who care about environment stuff, whatever. They're in the college, they promote such ideas, which is fine, but they're not
with
the majority.
Consensus of the party.
Yeah, within the consensus party, among campus, I mean, among two of the top universities of China, you have the Green Group, you have like climate change group.
And which are the relationships nowadays between China and Taiwan?
China and Taiwan is another very long-standing, I would call it, a legacy of history. That's also largely depending on how bad that US-China relation can go. It served as almost like a barometer of China-US relations for the Taiwan issue.
But if they put their hand on Taiwan, it could be a war.
It is a very precarious situation, put in this way. It's a very precarious situation. The danger comes from that within Taiwan, because in the past, there has always been a mainland Beijing-friendly party in charge, and therefore the current status quo was well maintained, and also for economic reason. But currently, both of the incumbent government, which is very much pro-independence, and also the opposition party that used to get on with Beijing very well in the past, and now also move towards some kind of political de facto independence. So this makes the situation become more complicated. That also within Beijing, there's a very strong voice among the military personnel and would prefer to have a military escalation. But I think ultimately the Taiwan issue are judging by two factors. And firstly, the healthiness of China-US relations, but secondly also how President Xi Jinping want to be remembered in the pantheon of the Chinese Communist Party. Whether he want to be remembered as someone that brought China into the middle to high level country, what I'm talking about, the 2035 goal, or he want to be remembered by someone that have reunited the country. So it's really up to him how he would like to be remembered. But surely by having military escalation, it is not in China's interest if China is going through a very painful economic transition. And by having military escalation with Taiwan, that means China would have to fully cut off from the world. That's not easy. It is not an easy decision to be made.
And is the Chinese army stronger and stronger? Are they investing more and more in the army?
Well, they are. I mean, this is part of the so-called modernization process.
They cannot be as strong as US at the moment.
I think that will take years to finish that catch-up stage while United States are still developing. So I think it will take years to come to that realization.
And how do you perceive relationships between China and the United States?
I mean, ideally, a peaceful coexistence would be the best mode. But at the moment, both Beijing and Washington's domestic environment wouldn't cultivate that so-called peaceful coexistence. China is prepared to have so-called protracted conflicts with United States.
Yeah, sort of conflict, not a real conflict.
Confrontation. Yeah, protracted confrontation with United States. Whereas United States, that domestically is a bipartisan consensus. I mean, there's only one thing Republicans and Democrats agree, which is about countering China. So the domestic environment are not benign for both countries to create that sense of peaceful coexistence that they would had back to the time of Bush era and Obama era. And that is the real worry, that two sides haven't really got a mechanism of mitigating the potential, mitigating not Cold War, but the constant conflicts and the constant confrontation they have one way or another. And also because of COVID, because of the stopped people-to-people exchange, and that made this process even faster.
At the end of the day, the Chinese perceive the world says that the American, let's call it empire, is now in a decadence, or they don't, or they still see America very strong?
They still see America very strong. The Chinese always have this aspiration to become like America in terms of economic wealth and that sense of power status. That's what the Chinese Communist Party always aspired to be, like some kind of hegemon in some sort. But however, I think much of the Western media have reported that the Chinese leadership suggested that the East is rise and the West is in decline. But the second half of the sentence, it is on that China has facing the so-called unprecedented challenge, which have not been seen in the last 100 years. And clearly that the leadership are aware the way ahead will become more and more difficult for China to be able to compete with the United States than, for example, in the past, that sense of peaceful coexistence.
In other words, what you're telling is that it's easier to grow than to maintain.
Yeah, it's much easier to grow faster, but to able to maintain that speed.
Do the Americans and the Chinese understand each other well? Because many times Americans failed in that kind of colonial, they failed recently in Afghanistan, they failed in Vietnam, they failed many times. And it's a common saying that they don't understand very well foreign politics. But this is, again, a European perception. Because maybe they do. And they have other, as you said before, right? This example of Australia, UK, maybe they are establishing a new order, or they have new views. So are they understanding each other well? They would like to have the same economical standards, but still one is a dictatorship and the other one is a democracy, and therefore their values are very different. And plus, China is a communist dictatorship, and therefore all this economical boom is a contradiction with the Marxist principles.
I don't think they understand each other very well at all, to be honest. Because what America have tried very hard since the establishment of formal diplomatic relations between the two is that America want to make China more like America, more like a liberal democracy. But that is one thing that Deng Xiaoping, and then after several generations of the Chinese leaders resist to become like a multi-party liberal democracy. So that's one difference. And I think that persistence that America wants to replicate its model to China, and hoping that by using economic...
But this is an American dream, right?
It's an American dream.
Convert countries to democracy, right?
Sure. It's a part of the American dream, but this is not part of the China dream, which Xi Jinping talking about it. So I think that's really from the ideological level, the two sides are not on the same page. So I think they don't understand each other very well at all. And secondly, on the individual pursuit, because in China, yes, they value individual pursuit, but I think every ordinary Chinese citizen somehow felt if the country goes up, it means the individual will also go up accordingly. So that sense of collective progress would be made. And such a thing does not exist in the United States, because in the United States it's always about if the individual has progressed fast and therefore the country will progress accordingly.
Yeah, but also the United States have many internal problems,
Sure,
right?
sure.
As much as China in a different way.
Yeah.
I mean, we have
Yeah.
seen, that the elections
Sure.
were very close,
Sure.
and that the ideas, there are lots of people in America who do not want to be
Sure.
vaccinated.
Sure.
There are lots of people in America who are, and also the ethnical America has
Yeah.
changed.
Yeah.
The more and more Spanish population, more and more let's say, white or Western population. So what will be America, as much as Europe, there's a more growing Muslim
Yeah.
population,
Sure.
which is a big change
Yeah.
in the European platform.
Sure.
So, which is not the case in China.
No.
I mean, Chinese remain ethnically.
I mean, China remain ethnically homogeneous. It is a still homogeneous country. It is a country that haven't really got substantial amount of migrants go into the China. So it's a monocultural country. Now, again,
This is again a big difference.
it's a huge difference compared with the United States, where individuality are much preserved. Where China, you're supposed to have one set of the standard, one set of values. Now, again, on your contradiction question, let me borrow one of my favorite novels, actually, the Italian novel, The Leopard. One of the favorite novel of Italy, one of my favorite novel from Italy is The Leopard. To describe the Communist Party, it's about, in order to keep everything the same, that everything will have to change. And that equally applied to the Chinese Communist Party's rule.
That's what happens in China.
That is what happened in China.
Il Gattopardo,
Yes.
Lampedusa.
Yes.
How is the cultural development of China? I mean, cinema, theater, music, literature. In a country where there is no freedom, you cannot write whatever you wish in the newspaper unless you go in exile somewhere. What is the cultural situation in China and the exchanges with other countries?
I mean, I can only speak on the territory that I'm familiar with. I'm a big classical music fan. So in the past, most of the Chinese cultural exchange are done with Soviet Union. So the Chinese ballet, the Chinese classical music are generally learned from Soviet Union. And then gradually, I think after 1979 onward, it was learned from America, learned from Europe. So in terms of the classical music, that China has a huge audience. This is part of by being the middle class. So part of by being looked like European, enjoyed European culture. So that is one element. Now another element is this very strong sense of traditional culture being preserved. So traditional Chinese music and traditional Chinese writing. And these are the things that the Chinese population, especially among the middle class, again, very much keen to preserve. And specifically at the time when President Xi came to power, that strong sense of revitalize the traditional Chinese culture play a much bigger role, I would say.
What about art?
Art, again, is a combination of both. So you have the traditional Chinese art, but you also have the oil paintings like this. And then in terms of contemporary art, and China is also a quite fertile ground for the contemporary art, but also for the art auction as well, as you have a growing number of middle class population. So that is also impact on
Buying works of art.
Buy works of art and also getting hold of the old masters and getting hold of some of the contemporary
Therefore,
arts.
old masters' art always comes from the Western countries, right?
Yeah.
So there is a kind of admiration for.
Oh yeah, I mean in terms of Europe, that China has really long admired Europe. I think even back to late 19th century.
And do they export the culture into the West?
Not so much. I mean, they try to use Confucius Institute to promote some kind of traditional culture, but it didn't really appeal much of the Western audience, I would say.
What are the most important values for the Chinese today, for your generation or younger generation? What they're looking for?
Stability. Stability of having job, the stability of being able to have a shelter. That sense of stability, that is the younger generation they are looking at.
And then there is a lot of nationalistic pride.
Yes, there's a strong, very, very strong nationalistic sentiment across the younger
You
generation.
can see that in sports.
Football is not particularly the illustrious example, as we never be able to qualify into the World Cup.
But you love some of the football players around the world,
Sure.
heroes in China.
Of course, and even there was an attempt to buy AC Milan, from the Chinese
And
purchasing.
this is allowed to, sports are free.
Sports are free, and then most of the subscription actually is for sports. If you look around Euro Cup, most of Euro Cup advertisement are in Chinese. Why? Because it's for the Chinese audience.
The football teams.
Yes, it's for the Chinese audience. So sports are very popular. Olympics are
Milan, for instance,
Yeah.
belongs to the Chinese. Is it perceived by the Chinese as a Chinese team?
No. It's perceived as being Azori. It's not being perceived as being.
And how many Chinese? They say that many Americans, like a huge percentage, don't have a passport.
Yeah.
They never went abroad. They don't even think about going abroad. What happens in China? How many people travel and how many people don't?
I don't know the precise number regarding passport ownership, but what I do know is each year you have more and more Chinese travel abroad, and especially the most favorite destination are Europe and America, because they want to see the world.
And all these goods that the rich Chinese have, right? Beautiful cars, or art collections, or fashion, are they creating jealousy in the country vis-a-vis the people who don't?
Yes, there's a very strong anti-rich sentiment among the population, and they're
And
not.
how is the party dealing with that?
So again, we come back to the earlier question. It's about the populism with the Chinese characteristics. It's like almost like Robin Hood approach. You letting the rich pay larger proportion of the societal contribution. At the moment that China doesn't even have a proper inheritance tax or wealth tax in place. It doesn't have that tax regime in
How
place.
does it work for a rich Chinese?
We shall see when that policy will be introduced. I'm expecting that policy to be introduced very soon.
Okay, so thank you very much
Not a
for
problem.
this long
My pleasure.
conversation.
Alain Elkann interviews.